There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when something impossible happens. Not quiet, not still, the kind that holds its breath. I was mid-note when I felt it, something ancient and heavy turning its full attention toward me. I didn't stop singing. I should have. But the song my grandmother pressed into my hands on her deathbed was already leaving my mouth, and I didn't yet know it belonged to someone else. Didn't know it had been kept like a wound for 25 years. Didn't know that across the room, something that had not felt anything in 2 centuries was feeling it now, and that by the time the last note left my lips, nothing about my life would ever be the same again. If you've ever carried something you didn't know was a secret, if grief has ever lived in you like an inheritance you never asked for, stay with me. Stories like this, one don't always find you twice. My Friday night slot at Celeste was the only thing standing between me and a very honest conversation with my landlord. 3 months behind on rent. A gig economy that had decided, apparently without consulting me, that live singers were decorative rather than essential. And a grandmother I'd buried 6 weeks ago, whose medical bills arrived in the mail every few days like small, precise cruelties, as if the universe wanted to make sure I didn't forget what losing her had cost. Celeste was not the kind of place I belonged. It sat on a quiet street in Richmond's old money corridor, a members-only club with dim chandeliers and velvet booths, and the kind of clientele who didn't look at prices before ordering. They tolerated me the way old estates tolerate the wind. They couldn't stop it from getting in, but they weren't going to acknowledge it either. I wasn't supposed to sing the Sicilian song. It wasn't on my set list. It wasn't even something I'd rehearsed in years. But I'd been off all evening, distracted by the shape of grief that still followed me everywhere since the funeral, and somewhere between the second and third song, my grandmother's voice moved through me like a current I couldn't redirect. Her hands on my face, the last night I saw her. Her eyes already going somewhere I couldn't follow. "Remember this song," she'd whispered, in the old dialect that I'd always half understood and never questioned. "Not for me. For someone who has been waiting." I thought she was delirious. Grief does that. Makes the dying speak in riddles, reach for meaning in the places where clarity has already left. I was wrong about that, as it turned out. I was wrong about most things that night. The song moved through the room differently than anything else I'd ever performed. I felt it, the way a temperature drops before a storm, the moment the air changed. Conversations didn't fade gradually, the way they usually do when a singer manages to earn the room's attention. They stopped. All at once. Like something had reached into the space and pressed its hand over every open mouth. I kept my eyes closed for most of it. That was habit, the closing off, the going inward, the pretending I was singing to no one so I wouldn't feel the specific loneliness of singing to a room full of people who weren't listening. But near the end of the last verse, something made me open them. He was at the VIP table in the far corner, and he was completely still. Not the polite stillness of someone being courteous. Not distraction or boredom. I mean still, the way very old things are still, like stone, like water before it moves. A man who looked no older than his late 30s, silver white hair, pale in the way that read less like complexion and more like the absence of something warm. A white suit that sat on him like authority. A glass of something dark and untouched in front of him. And his eyes, fixed on me with an expression I didn't have language for yet. Not desire. Not admiration. Recognition. Raw and broken and very, very old. When I finished, the applause started. I barely heard it, because he was already moving, unhurried, inevitable, through the room toward the stage. The 2 men who'd been flanking his table moved with him, but he raised one hand without looking back, and they stopped. He stopped at the edge of the stage, looked up at me, And when he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that it should have been lost in the room's resumed murmur. But I heard every word as clearly as if he'd pressed them directly into my chest. "Where did you learn that song?" Not beautiful performance or lovely voice or any of the social graces a room like this ran on.
Just that. Direct.
Patient. The question of a man who had been waiting a very long time to ask it and had finally, after 25 years, found someone who could answer. I looked at him, this pale, impossible stranger with grief sitting in his eyes like something that had never been allowed to leave, and felt something pull in me. Not attraction.
Something older than that.
Something that felt, strangely, like coming home to a place I'd never been. "My grandmother taught it to me," I said. Something moved across his face. Something he controlled almost immediately, but not quite fast enough. "I'd like to offer you a job," he said. "It will pay well. It will ask more of you than you expect." A pause. "And it begins tonight, if you're willing." I should have said no. I was tired and underpaid, and the last thing I needed was a stranger with a security detail and grief in his eyes pulling me further from the ordinary life I was barely holding together. Instead, I heard myself say, "Tell me what you need." And he said, very quietly, "I need you to help me find out what happened to my wife." He sent a car.
Of course he did.
Not a word of explanation between the club and the estate. Just 40 minutes of Virginia darkness sliding past the window, the Blue Ridge rising against the night sky like something that had been waiting there long before anyone thought to name it. I watched the trees thicken and the road narrow and told myself I was only doing this because the rent was due and the medical bills weren't going anywhere, and a woman with nothing left to lose can afford to be curious. I'd been lying to myself for years. I was good at it. The manor sat at the end of a private drive, half hidden by oaks so old their roots had lifted the stone path in places. It wasn't what I expected. I think I'd imagined something cold, glass and sharp edges, the architecture of power that wants you to feel small. This was different. The house had the quality of something that had absorbed centuries of weather and grief, and kept going anyway. It looked, if anything, tired. The way a person looks tired, not a building. Alexander met me at the door and led me through corridors that smelled of old paper and candle wax to a wing that had been sealed off from the rest of the house. He unlocked it himself. Didn't give the key to anyone else.
Didn't explain why.
The room beyond was not a room that had been abandoned. It had been preserved. There is a difference, and I felt it the moment I stepped inside, the same way you feel the difference between a grave and a shrine. Someone had kept the dust off the shelves. Someone had made sure the curtains were drawn against the light. The books were arranged the way a person arranges books they return to, not the way someone arranges books for show. She had loved color. That was the first thing I noticed. Journals in deep burgundy and forest green. A scarf draped over the back of a chair that had no business still being that vivid after 25 years. Photographs tucked into frames and mirror edges. A woman laughing, always laughing, caught mid-sentence in half of them, as if the camera had tried to hold her still and she'd refused. Alexander stood near the doorway and said nothing. I sat down at the writing desk and opened the first journal. Serafina's handwriting was small and quick and full of personality. The letters pressed harder when she was angry, looped wider when she was happy, and I know this because within 20 pages I could already read her moods the way you read someone you've known for years. She wrote about music, about the way certain silences felt inhabited, about the specific loneliness of being in a room full of people who didn't know what you actually were. I stopped at that line and read it again. The loneliness of being in a room full of people who don't know what you actually are. I had written something almost identical in the journal. I kept the winter my mother died, and my grandmother sat me down and told me we were, the two of us, entirely alone in the world now. I was 4 years old, and I hadn't understood the words, but I'd understood the weight of them, and I've been carrying that weight ever since, and I had never once in my life met someone who seemed to know what it felt like.
Until now.
Except she was dead, and I was sitting in the room she'd left behind. I kept reading. I couldn't stop. Not because I was looking for anything. Alexander hadn't told me what specifically he needed, not yet, but because every few pages Serafina would write something that reached through the decades and touched something I kept locked in the back of myself. The way she described performing. The particular quality of belonging to a gift that takes more than it gives. The complicated gratitude of being raised by someone who loves you past the point of their own well-being. My grandmother had loved me like that. With her whole body, her whole life, her whole quiet sacrifice of every plan she might have once had for herself. I used to feel the weight of that love like a gift. Lately I felt it like a question I'd never gotten to ask. An hour passed. Maybe 2. I didn't look up. When I finally did, Alexander was in the chair by the window. He wasn't reading, wasn't on his phone. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't interpret. Not scrutiny, not curiosity exactly. Something more careful than either. The way you watch something you're not ready to name yet. She wrote beautifully, I said, because I needed to say something. Yes. His voice was very quiet. She always said writing was the one place she didn't have to perform. I looked back down at the open journal. Serafina had written, in the margin of a page about a winter evening in this very house, a single line in a smaller hand, as if it were an afterthought. As if she'd come back to the page later and added it when no one was watching. If she ever finds these words, I hope she knows I thought of her. Even before I knew she existed. Some love works that way. It arrives before the reason does. My throat closed. I didn't know why. I told myself it was fatigue. The grief still loose in my body from the funeral. The strangeness of the night. I told myself a lot of things. Alexander said, very gently, as if he'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Are you all right? And the honest answer, the one I didn't say, was that I hadn't been all right in a very long time. But something in that room, in those pages, in a handwriting that felt so unbearably familiar, was doing something to the edges of that. Softening them. Like a door I hadn't known was closed beginning, very slowly, to open. I'm fine, I said.
He didn't believe me.
I could tell by the way he didn't push. Some people understand pain well, enough not to chase it. I turned the page and kept reading. I found it on the 4th day. Not because I was looking for something specific. Alexander still hadn't told me exactly what he needed, and I still hadn't asked, and we had settled into this careful rhythm of proximity and silence that felt less strange than it should have. I would arrive in the morning. He would be there already, sometimes reading, sometimes simply present in the way that very old things are present, occupying space with a kind of permanence that made the room feel anchored. I would work through Serafina's journals and correspondence. He would watch, occasionally. We would speak when there was something worth saying, and we had both apparently decided, without discussing it, that very little qualified. I was used to performing for rooms that didn't see me. I was not used to being watched by someone who saw too much. There is a difference, and I felt it every day I walked into that room. The letter was tucked inside the back cover of the last journal, not folded neatly the way Serafina folded everything, but pressed flat with the urgency of someone who needed it hidden quickly. The paper was a different weight than the journal pages. Older, somehow, even though the date in the corner told me it was among the most recent things she'd written. I read the first line and went still. Not the ordinary stillness of concentration. The stillness of a body that has understood something before the mind has finished catching up. Serafina wrote in a hand that was almost unrecognizable, tighter, smaller, stripped of all the personality that made her writing feel like a voice. As if she were trying to take up as little space as possible. As if she were trying to disappear from the page even as she was pressing herself into it. She wrote about a conversation she wasn't supposed to have overheard. Names she didn't write down, only initials even then. A meeting in one of the lower corridors of the court. 2 voices she recognized, speaking about something called the Verith prophecy and what it would mean if the bloodline continued. What they would have to do to ensure it didn't. She wrote, I understood then that I had never been safe here. I had only been tolerated. And tolerance, I have learned, has a very short memory when fear arrives. I set the letter on the desk. My hands were not entirely steady. Alexander. He was beside me before I finished saying his name. I don't know if that was vampire speed or if he'd already been watching closely enough to know. I handed him the letter without a word. He read it standing. I watched his face the way you watch a sky that's about to change, not wanting to look away, afraid of what the change will be. His expression did not break. It did something quieter and more devastating than breaking. It settled into a grief so old and so certain that it had long since stopped fighting to show itself and simply existed, the way scar tissue exists, not dramatic, not fresh, just permanently there. When he finished, he didn't set the letter down immediately. He held it for a moment with a care that made my throat hurt. Then, very quietly, she was pregnant when she left. The room did something to sound in that moment. Absorbed it, maybe. I heard my own heartbeat. How do you know? My voice came out smaller than I intended. He turned the letter over. Along the bottom edge of the back, in letters so small I'd missed them entirely, was a line of text in a script I didn't recognize. Not the elegant Italian of her journals. Something older. Compressed and careful and frightened. She used this only when she was afraid someone else would read it, he said. An old dialect. One she learned from her mother, who learned it from hers. She told me once that it was the language she kept for truths too important to risk. He translated it aloud. His voice didn't shake. I think it took everything he had to keep it from shaking, and I think that restraint was its own kind of grief. The grief of a man who has had centuries to learn how to contain himself and finds, in this moment, that containment is the cruelest thing left available to him. What she had written, in that small and frightened hand, was this: I am carrying something precious, and I cannot let them know. I don't know yet what it is. Only that it exists. Only that it is new. Only that I would die before I let them touch it. I am leaving tonight. I am not coming back. Forgive me for not waiting. Forgive me for not finding a way to tell you. You will think I am gone. Please do not stop loving what we were. Please do not let them make you hard. Neither of us spoke. The blue ridge outside the windows held its long, indifferent silence. Somewhere in the house, something settled, a sound like the building exhaling. I was thinking about my grandmother, about the way she had raised me alone, always alone, never explaining why, deflecting every question about my father with a gentleness so practiced it had never once seemed like a lie. About the way she'd pressed that song into my hands at the end like an act of navigation, not for me, for someone who has been waiting, and how I had interpreted that as the poetry of a dying woman when perhaps, it had been something else entirely. I was thinking about the handwriting that felt like my own. The loneliness described in terms I had used in private journals no one had ever read. The way this room had felt, from the first moment, less like a stranger's history and more like an answer to a question I hadn't known I was asking.
I didn't say any of this.
I wasn't ready. And I think Alexander, for all that he had already begun to understand, wasn't ready either. Some truths need a moment to be survived before they can be spoken. We were both, in our separate silences, trying to survive this one. I have learned, In the years since my mother died and left me to be raised by a woman who loved me like a second heartbeat, that grief has a particular relationship with time. It doesn't move through you the way people say it does. It doesn't pass. It accumulates, layers of it, each new loss pressing down on the ones beneath, until you stop expecting relief and start learning instead to carry the weight upright. I thought I understood grief. I thought I had a thorough and unsentimental education in it. I was not prepared for what it felt like to grieve someone I had never known I'd lost. We didn't speak about the letter's implication directly. Not that night, not the next morning. But something had shifted between us. The careful professional distance I'd been maintaining had developed a crack, and through it came something neither of us had agreed to let in. Alexander began staying in the archive room longer. Not watching me work from across the room, but sitting at the desk beside me, pulling documents himself, cross-referencing dates in silence. We worked the way people work when the task has become personal, not methodically but hungrily, with the particular focus of two people who have decided that whatever is buried here needs to be seen. The court records arrived in 3 heavy binders that Alexander had requested from a secured archive on the estate grounds. Official documentation of Serafina's final months in residence. Medical reports. Witness statements. A formal record of death, cause listed as a hemorrhagic fever, swift and systemic, with a note that burial had been expedited to prevent contagion. I read the medical report twice. Then I set it down and looked at Alexander. How many physicians signed this? 1, he said. He already knew. He had already seen it. He had lived with this document for 25 years and never once, apparently, looked at it the way I was looking at it now, because no one had ever given him reason to. 1 physician. 1 witness signature on the death record. A burial completed within 36 hours, while Alexander was abroad attending to matters the court had deemed urgent enough to require his personal presence. The timing of that summons, I noticed, was dated 4 days before Serafina's supposed death. Someone had moved him out of the way first. The thread didn't just unravel. It dissolved. Every document we pulled was the same, too clean, too aligned, too perfectly consistent in the way that real events never are. Real events have friction, conflicting accounts, small discrepancies, the ordinary mess of truth happening to multiple people simultaneously. This had none of that. This had the smoothness of a story that had been prepared in advance. Alexander said very little, but I watched what the silence was costing him. The way he would stop sometimes over a page, not reading, just stopped, and I understood he was doing the mathematics of every year of grief he'd carried and measuring it against the possibility that it had been constructed for him. Handed to him like a sentence. I wanted to say something. I didn't have words adequate to it, and I've been performing long enough to know that reaching for inadequate words is worse than sitting with the silence.
So I sat with it.
Beside him. And I think that was the right thing because he never asked me to leave. The first warning arrived on the 6th day. A note slipped under the door of the guest room Alexander had quietly arranged for me to use. I hadn't gone back to my apartment since the second night, and neither of us had made a formal arrangement of it. It had simply become true the way certain things do. The note was handwritten on heavy paper, no signature. For words, leave before they remember. I brought it to Alexander. He read it once, folded it, and placed it in his jacket pocket with a stillness that told me this was not entirely surprising to him, that he had already begun, quietly and without telling me, to test the loyalties of the people around him, asking careful questions, watching who answered too quickly, noting who avoided the archive wing. Someone in this house? I asked. Or someone with access to it? His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It changes nothing. It means we're close. 3 days later, I smelled the smoke. The archive room was at the end of a long corridor, and by the time I reached it, the fire was contained, small, already dying, set in the corner near the shelving that housed the older correspondence. The damage was minor, mostly because 4 days earlier, without a specific reason I could have named then, I had taken the most fragile and most important letters, Serafina's hidden letter, the early court records, the documents with a single physician's signature, and moved them to a locked case in my room. I stood in the doorway of the scorched archive room and understood something I had been circling without wanting to land on. This was not about the past anymore. Whoever had built the lie that buried Serafina was still here, still present, still trusted, still positioned, still watching, and now watching me specifically because I was the thread they hadn't anticipated. A woman who sang a dead woman's song in a nightclub in Richmond. A woman who had walked into this estate and started pulling at the seams of a story that had held for 25 years. They weren't just afraid of what I'd find. They were afraid of what I already carried, of what I was, even if I hadn't said it aloud yet. Even if Alexander and I were still circling that particular truth with the care of two people who understood that some revelations, once spoken, cannot be contained. That night, Alexander found me sitting on the floor of the corridor outside the archive room, back against the wall, not crying but very close to it in the way that is somehow worse than crying, that dry, pressurized feeling behind your sternum when the grief is too large and too complicated to move.
He sat down beside me.
On the floor, a vampire king who had lived for centuries, in a suit that probably cost more than my entire life's earnings, sitting on a stone corridor floor beside a woman who still didn't fully know what she was to him. He didn't say anything. He simply sat there. And I thought about my grandmother raising me alone for 27 years, keeping a secret so heavy it had bowed her by the end, whispering a song into my hands like a compass, and hoping I would find my way to the right door. I had found it. I was sitting outside it right now. And whatever was on the other side, I was no longer afraid to open it. There is a particular kind of document that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with the weight you'd expect. It doesn't feel different in your hands. It looks, from the outside, like everything else in an archive of someone's life, folded, preserved, ordinary in the way that all old paper eventually becomes ordinary. You open it the same way you've opened 100 others. And then the words arrange themselves in front of you, and something in your chest goes very quiet, the way a city goes quiet before a storm that has already decided where it's going to land. I found it inside a ledger that had been misfiled, or filed deliberately among the household accounts for the year Serafina disappeared, where no one searching for court correspondence would think to look. Someone had been careful. But careful, I've learned, is not the same as thorough. Careful people make small errors when they're afraid.
They move fast.
They choose proximity over logic. They put things where they won't be found quickly rather than where they won't be found ever. The document was 3 pages, written in a formal hand I had come to recognize over the past 2 weeks. Dorian Vale's correspondence had a particular character, precise, deliberate, the penmanship of a man who understood that written words outlast their authors and chose each one accordingly. I had read dozens of his official communications in the council records. I knew his cadence. I knew the way he constructed a sentence when he wanted it to be unambiguous. This was unambiguous. It was a directive. Dated 11 days before Alexander was summoned away from the estate on the urgent council business that had conveniently required his absence. 4 names at the bottom. Dorian Vale, first and largest, with the weight of authority behind it. 3 others beneath his, council members I had seen referenced throughout the records, names that appeared at Alexander's table in photographs, in formal correspondences, in the documented history of every significant decision the court had made across 2 decades. All still here. All still trusted. All still standing at Alexander's side at this very moment, in this very house, as we pulled apart the lie they had built together. The directive described the prophecy in formal language that made it sound administrative, a risk assessment, almost the way corporations discuss liability. The Verith line, if continued through a half-blood heir, would represent an existential destabilization of the current power structure. The hybrid inheritance, human resilience compounded by immortal capability, was categorized as an unacceptable variable. The recommended course of action was described in 3 numbered points. The third point was Seraphina's name. Not her death, specifically. Her removal. Her permanent displacement from the court and from Alexander's knowledge. The note beside her name, in Dorian Vale's precise hand, read, "He must believe she is gone. Grief will manage him more effectively than force. A king in mourning does not look for what he thinks he has already buried." I sat with that sentence for a long time. Grief will manage him. They had looked at a man who loved his wife and seen a mechanism.
A tool.
They had taken his capacity for love and calculated exactly how to weaponize it against him, and then they had done it, and then they had stood at his side for 25 years watching it work, watching him carry a grief they had engineered, watching him build his entire reign around the hollow space they had deliberately carved into him. I picked up the document and went to find Alexander. He was in the study at the end of the east wing, standing at the window the way he often did in the evenings, watching the blue ridge fold itself into darkness. He turned when I entered, took one look at my face, and whatever he saw there made him very still. I didn't say anything. I crossed the room and held out the document. He took it. Read it. The whole thing, all 3 pages, without stopping. Without any change in his expression that I could name as a specific emotion. Just the reading, thorough, complete, the way you read something you need to have fully inside you before you decide what to do with it. Then he closed it, held it in both hands, and looked for a moment at nothing. That was the thing I will never be able to describe adequately and will never stop trying to, the look on his face in that moment. People talk about betrayal like it's an event. Sharp, sudden, a door slamming.
But what I saw was not that.
What I saw was a man realizing that the room he had been locked in for 25 years had not been built by circumstance or fate or the random cruelty of a world that takes people too soon. It had been built by hands he knew, by people who had watched him grieve and called it management. The grief on his face was not new grief. It was old grief changing shape, the specific devastation of understanding that every year of mourning, every sleepless night, every moment of absence and ache and hollow survival had been someone else's instrument. That his love for Seraphina had been looked at by people who ate at his table and found it useful. He didn't rage. I think I'd expected rage. I think I'd braced for it. Instead, he stood at the window in the gathering dark and absorbed it the way old things absorb damage, not breaking, not bending, simply taking it in with a terrible, quiet permanence. He said my name.
Once. Softly.
Not as a question. Not as the beginning of a sentence. Just my name, the way you say the name of someone you are grateful is in a room. Then he set the document on the desk and straightened. Whatever passed across his face in those next few seconds, I was not meant to see all of it. But I saw enough to know that somewhere behind the stillness, something had made a decision. He handled it in the days that followed the way he handled everything, without theater, without announcement. Dorian Vale and the 3 names beneath his simply ceased to be present in the house. There were no scenes, no confrontations I was invited to witness. Doors were closed. The house rearranged itself quietly around their absence, the way water closes over a stone. I didn't ask what had been done. I was old enough to understand that some questions are courtesies we perform for our own comfort rather than genuine inquiries. He had told me he would handle it. He had handled it. And in his world, As in most worlds where power is real rather than symbolic, handling it meant something irreversible. What stayed with me was not the document itself, not even the names. It was the sentence I couldn't stop hearing in Dorian Vale's careful, deliberate hand. Grief will manage him more effectively than force. I thought about my grandmother at the end, pressing a song into my hands like a set of coordinates. I thought about 27 years of questions she deflected with such practiced gentleness that I had never once felt the deflection. I thought about a woman named Serafina who had run into the dark carrying something she didn't yet fully understand, trying to protect it with the only tool she had: disappearance, silence, distance, the hope that love could survive being hidden. I thought about what it costs a woman to protect something precious by making herself invisible. And I sat with the understanding that was no longer a possibility I was circling, but a truth I had already arrived at, that the woman in those journals, whose handwriting felt like my own, whose loneliness I had recognized before I had any reason to, whose song my grandmother had kept for 27 years like something sacred, had not stopped loving us. Either of us. Even from wherever she had gone. The negotiations took place in a room that had been designed centuries ago for exactly this kind of reckoning. A long table, stone walls that absorbed sound and gave nothing back, candles rather than electric light, not for atmosphere but because Alexander had told me, quietly, the morning before, that certain members of the old factions responded to firelight in ways they didn't respond to anything modern. Something ancient in them recognizing something ancient in the room, loosening the carefully maintained performances they arrived wearing. He told me this because I had asked. He told me most things now, when I asked, that had changed somewhere in the weeks after Dorian Vale's removal. The way Alexander moved around me had shifted, grown less guarded, as if something he'd been bracing for had finally arrived, and the bracing was no longer necessary. There was a relief in it that he would never name directly, and didn't need to. I recognized it. I had felt it myself the first time someone loved me without requiring me to be smaller than I was. 6 factions. 3 with direct historical ties to the old council structure that had protected the cover-up. 3 others who had simply profited from the stability the lie had maintained, and were now recalculating what stability would look like under a reorganized power structure. None of them were pleased to be there. All of them were afraid not to be. Alexander had asked me to sit beside him. Not behind him, beside him. At the table. He'd said it simply, the night before, without ceremony. I need you there. Not as a witness. As a presence. I'd understood what he meant. These were beings who had lived for centuries by reading threats and calculating advantages, and they had almost no framework for reading a human woman who had walked into the center of their world and started pulling apart its foundational lie without flinching. I was not threatening to them in the ways they knew how to respond to. I was something else, something that didn't fit their existing categories, and that, Alexander understood, was its own kind of leverage. I sat beside him, and I did what I have always done in rooms where I don't quite belong. I watched. I listened beneath the words, the way my grandmother taught me to listen to music, not just the notes being played but the ones being held back, the tension in the space between sounds. I watched who looked at each other when they thought no one was looking. I noted who deferred and to whom, whose confidence was performance and whose was bone deep. I passed Alexander small folded notes twice during the proceedings, once to flag that the representative of the Eastern faction was lying about the timeline he'd given, and once to observe that the youngest faction leader in the room, a woman named Petra Solon who had said almost nothing for the first 2 hours, was the one everyone else kept watching when they thought they were being subtle about it. She was the one whose agreement would bring the others. Alexander redirected his address to her within minutes of my second note. By the 4th hour, a framework had been agreed to, fragile, contingent, requiring months of careful maintenance. But agreed to. The old order's architecture, built on fear and manufactured grief, and the calculated silencing of a woman who had only ever wanted to be safe, had its first real crack in it. When the room emptied, Alexander sat in the silence for a long moment. Then he looked at me and said, "Your mother would have done exactly what you just did." It was the first time he had said it that plainly, without the careful distance of implication, without the protective vagueness of a man still afraid of what naming the truth would cost him. "Your mother." I didn't trust my voice immediately, so I nodded, and we sat together in the candlelit room while the weight of it settled over us like something that had been waiting a long time to be set down. He took me to the grave that evening. It was in the garden at the east side of the estate, a part of the grounds I hadn't been to, partially enclosed by old stone walls with climbing things growing over them that had been left to grow freely, the way you leave things when you want nature to make a place feel less like a marker and more like a shelter. The headstone was simple. Her name, her dates, nothing else, because Alexander had told me once, without elaborating, that he hadn't been able to find words adequate to her and had chosen silence over insufficiency. The ground was soft from recent rain. The Blue Ridge sat against the sky in the last of the evening light, that particular Virginia purple that I had been watching from windows for weeks and had started, without meaning to think of as home. Alexander knelt. I stood beside him and watched him put his hand on the stone with a tenderness that undid something in the back of my chest. He stayed that way for a long moment, not speaking. Then he began to talk to her. His voice was low. He told her about the letters, how her handwriting had survived and her voice had survived inside it, and the love she'd pressed into every page had survived everything they'd tried to do to it. He told her about Dorian Vale, not with anger, because anger had already been spent, but with the precision of a man filing a report to someone who deserved to know. He told her about the negotiations, about Petra Solon, about the fragile new order beginning to take shape from the ruins of the one that had been built on her disappearance.
And then he told her about me.
He told her about a nightclub in Richmond and a Sicilian song and a woman standing at a microphone in a denim jacket who had no idea what she was carrying into the room. He told her about the handwriting, the phrasing, the way I described loneliness in terms so close to hers that the first time he'd noticed it, he'd had to leave the room. He told her about the way I sat with grief, not fighting it, not performing recovery, just carrying it upright the way she had always carried it, and how that had been the first moment he'd known with his whole body rather than just his mind. His voice broke once. Only once. On the word daughter. And he let it break, and he didn't try to recover from it quickly, and I understood that this was a man who had finally, after 25 years, given himself permission to feel the full size of what had been taken from him. I reached down and took his hand. He looked up at me. "She never stopped protecting me," I said, "even when she didn't know she was."
The song.
The journals. The letters she wrote and kept and folded away in places where someone who needed them would eventually find them. She was protecting me before she knew I existed. My throat was tight, but my voice held. She loved me before she met me. I don't know how to carry that yet, but I know it's true. Alexander looked at me for a long moment. The evening light was almost gone. The garden was very still. "Neither will I," he said. "Neither will I." It was not a declaration. It was not a performance of paternal feeling for my benefit. It was the quiet, permanent, utterly undramatic statement of a man making a promise to the ground beneath his hands and the woman standing beside him simultaneously. A commitment that asked for nothing in return and required no response because it was not conditional on one. I had spent 27 years not knowing what it felt like to have a father. I had spent 27 years carrying a name with no origin, a face with no mirror, a song with no context. I had performed in rooms that didn't see me and survived losses that didn't pause for my convenience, and built a life from the pieces available to me with the stubbornness of someone who learned early that no one was coming to make things easier. And now I was standing in a garden in Virginia with my hand in the hand of a vampire king who is also, improbably, impossibly, irrevocably, my father, and somewhere beneath us, in ground that had held its secret long enough, Seraphina Sullivan was finally being told that it was all right. That the things she had protected had been found. That the love she had scattered into journals and margins and the memory of a song in the hands of a dying woman had traveled every mile and year it needed to and arrived, finally, where it was always meant to be. I didn't cry until we were walking back to the house. And when I did, Alexander said nothing. He simply kept hold of my hand, and we walked through the darkening Virginia evening together, and behind us the garden held its quiet, and the stone held her name, and for the first time in my life the silence around me did not feel like absence. It felt like enough. It felt, God help me, like the beginning of something. If you felt something in this story, if some part of it touched a grief you've been carrying quietly, a longing you haven't had words for, a love you were given before you were old enough to recognize it, then you already know why these stories matter.
There are more of them.
More women who found their way into worlds they weren't supposed to survive, and did. If you haven't already, subscribe. Not for the uploads. For the feeling of knowing they're there when you need them. For the knowledge that somewhere, someone is telling the stories that understand you. Don't let that slip away.